I spent quite a lot of time trying to find answers.
It was without a purpose.
I was kind of winging it. Everything was wrong according to YouTube.
I was almost too embarrassed to ask the questions.
Not knowing really where to go.
What I was learning from books.
Just wouldn't make sense to me. I just thought, what are you talking about?
I spent a lot of time trying to get answers to very basic and simple questions.
It felt really frustrating that being a born Muslim,
Not knowing what to look for, not knowing where to look for it, and feeling quite alone.
What was wonderful for me about iSyllabus was
it felt very familiar and it was very accessible.
It was a structured learning process. It was done in a teaching manner which was very relaxed.
It wasn't in pieces, it was continuous and it flowed like a river.
they understood where the younger people and people like me were coming from.
It was so evidence-based, it was logical, it was easy to follow.
And it truly is transformational when you understand that you can live your life with ease.
It was having the knowledge to be able to physically carry out worship, but also having that intention there to match that worship.
One of the most important changes that happens when you go through iSyllabus is the spiritual development that happens.
Opening your mind, opening your horizons, looking at the depths of spirituality that people have felt and experienced for centuries. They are put on a plate in front of you.
And going through iSyllabus and going through the learning with teachers that have that grounding in traditional knowledge and academia.
I felt more grounded in my foundations.
iSyllabus kind of like just showed me how to live as a human, how to live as a Muslim.
It's designed for people in the UK. It's designed in English, but the scholars are so knowledgeable that they can make even the most complicated things simple for you.
And I'm so grateful for the fact that I can teach my children the basics at a young age, the confusion which I had growing up.
But without iSyllabus giving me that base knowledge to take that step, I don't believe that I would be where I am today.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I would like to welcome everyone who are joining us today for our Facebook, YouTube, online live session today with Sheikh Ruzwan. Today, inshallah, we'll be talking about a very interesting topic, very topical. In fact, we all know what happened in the last few weeks here in the UK and the general kind of mood that we're seeing in the country. So, inshallah, the topic of today is integration, assimilation, or emigration, what the Sunnah would tell us if we listened. And we have Sheikh Ruzwan with us, who I plan to unpack some of this. Just talking about the live events, also looking at from a historical, philosophical, sociological point of view, and of course from deep within our tradition. Inshallah, before I would start, a couple of announcements. So number one, the iSyllabus Diploma live classes will be going beyond simply streaming. You'll now be able to take part through the live Q&A, instant polls, moderated chat, and splatterings of real-time commentary on current issues. So enrollment is open today. And also, you can earn £40 every time you share iSyllabus with a friend and family, and a discount for them. And you can get all of these updates on the iSyllabus Instagram, Facebook, and also on their website. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, Sheikh Ruzwan.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Sheikh, how are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm very well. Just better for the wear of the last couple of weeks in terms of what's been happening. It's been an interesting couple of weeks, especially last week, watching the kind of fallout from the kind of massive demonstration that took place, or march that took place in London. So, this topic was chosen for us almost by by the events that took place. It's not good to be reactionary and to do events based upon events that take place. But essentially what did happen is that you had this massive march. And over the last week or so, I've had interesting conversations with people. You probably had conversations as well with people about, it's a wake-up call in some way, but it's not something that's unexpected. I think there's certain blind spots that we have as a community that I think we need to address. And this topic has been dealt with me a number of times in the past, but it's very important, I think, because of the critical nature of the question itself, to revisit it, often, because we are in a very precarious situation, meaning not just Muslims, but I think society generally is in a very precarious situation. And you do need to revisit these things, almost like, I would say, revisiting the rules of prayer and fasting and, the things that we have to refresh. So we have to touch base and say, okay, are we getting things right? For example, somebody's praying or fasting, and they need to touch base and say, okay, am I praying properly? Am I fasting properly? Am I giving zakat properly? I think there is a degree of intellectual dismissiveness amongst a lot of Muslims, in which they think that their ideological decisions that they've made over the last decade or so, or even before that, do not require to be reassessed as well. So if you were, let's just say, if you were allied to a kind of left-wing agenda, for example, and you felt that that was the best way of proceeding, and it was all about rights and minority fiqh and minority rights, then you have to reassess that and say, well, is there a case for actually veering towards a more conservative, a more theological perspective on these issues, and taking your lenses not from ideology, not from politics, but from theology and more conservative ideas about what the family is, what society is, and what stability is. And I think that's one of the things that I've always felt we need to do, the community needs to do, because I don't feel they do it enough, or they don't do it. So you'll find people that adhere to a kind of left-wing agenda will have been like that for years and years and years. Where society has moved, I don't know if you look in and keep up to date with a lot of the social commentators. A lot of the social commentators that are right-wing now are at the demonstrations, insisting that Muslims be sent back home, are people that were perhaps a decade ago left-wing. They were socialists, and they were kind of very much on the bandwagon of rights, the rights agenda. And so Muslims, I think we need to do that, because we shouldn't be reactionary. We shouldn't just jump because an event takes place. But it's important that we reassess everything. Everything's on the table. You kind of discuss it. And I think the big thing that you need to look at is the religious voice, the religious input into this whole discussion. Because a lot of times, in fact, almost always, the religious element of it is considered to be not elaborate enough, not nuanced enough, and not really relevant. People think it's not really relevant. I was at Jum'ah a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking, well, this could be anywhere in the world. It's as if nothing's happening in the UK or in the West, and the topic was irrelevant. It's almost as if that provides a case for those people that say, well, religious viewpoints and religious input is not relevant in these kind of discussions.
Right. I'm not going to ask you which mosque it was.
It was a mosque. Let's just say it was a mosque.
I do understand that, and we often hear that the khutbahs sometimes are kind of detached. I'm going to start off with something a bit lighter. I know the audience are a bit awake. I'm going to start off from the wisdom of our parents and grandparents who came to this country, Sheikh, and said, we're going to work. And then when the second and third generation put our roots in, and when we wanted to sell our homes in Pakistan and say to the elders, we're never going to go there, they're like, listen, remember, they may kick you out one day. And we're like, huh? We've got multiculturalism, we have got diversity quotas, and is that a ball in the air? Were the elders right? Or has our kind of confidence been shattered?
Is that your light introduction? I'm waiting for the heavy stuff. If that's your light introduction, I thought you'd come up with a joke. I mean, I would think like, give me something like, oh, a Scotsman, an Englishman, and an Irishman walk into a pub, and they see Billy, who's actually Bilal, sitting there with a pint of lager, and so where's integration and assimilation there? Because that would be, lighthearted. But that's a very deep question because. Parents. I mean, if your ethnic kind of background is from some other country like Syria or Libya or Pakistan or somewhere, then obviously people did emigrate from places and came in as immigrants to certain places. The reasons why they did that were different. Remember, I don't want to go into the history, but Enoch Powell, Enoch Powell was considered to be the most eloquent orator in the English language of the last century. I think the listeners of Radio 4 had a vote, and he was considered to be the most eloquent English speaker of the last century. He's famous for his rivers of blood speech, in which he almost prophesied, let's just say, rivers of destruction and blood if immigration was allowed to continue as it was. He was talking the 60s. But the problem he was dealing with was actually a fallout from the British Raj and British imperialism, which was the empire created not citizens but subjects. So citizens essentially are people who belong to a state and they have rights. Yeah. So you now we're British citizens, but before,
Yes, correct.
When he was speaking, we were subjects. In other words, what that meant was we're subject to the king or the queen, but also we have rights to come and reside in the empire. And that was a loophole that had to be closed. And Enoch Powell essentially was talking about that loophole, which would allow people from Jamaica, from Southern Africa, from the subcontinent to come and just say, guys, we're subjects of the queen, and this is our land, this is our empire, and you could integrate. And obviously didn't factor in racism, didn't factor in kind of the whole trend of ethno-nationalism. And so when we talk about our parents, they came and they basically came on the back of being subjects, almost economic migrants, but also at a deeper level subjects to the British state. Now things have changed. We're now citizens. In other words, we are now told that we have rights. So we're told that we have rights that are enshrined within the legal system, minority rights, for example. So a lot of our discussions about our rights that we have as a protected minority, religion is one of the protected characteristics, as well as gender and disability and these kind of things. And so I don't think it's the right thing to say were they right or wrong. I think that the issue now is about widening it to the religious input, which is at what point do you become part of a country? At what point do you feel part of a country? At what point, let's just say, at what point do you say, these are my qawm, these are my people? So this is important because that relates to culture, language, cuisine, it relates to sport, it relates to, I was watching something about Liverpool, and it was talking about, there's a whole rise in racist attacks. And there was one city that bucked the trend. It was Liverpool, because Mohamed Salah was playing for Liverpool, and it actually lessened the amount of reported attacks, racist attacks in Liverpool, anti-Muslim attacks in Liverpool. And so the culture, the sport, cuisine, language, music, art, all these things get to the point that you now say, these are my people. And at that point, when you start to say that these are your people, and you start to feel for the people who are indigenous, let's just say indigenous, meaning you acknowledge that you have a background which is not from this country in terms of your family background, there's a certain point that you integrate to the point that you're the same as the Anglo-Saxons or the Jutes or all the other people that came into the British Isles or into America or into Europe, so you become at one. And at that point, we have to now think, what I've heard from our Muslim politicians, and still hear from them, what I hear from our Muslim political activists, is still the language of rights. That this is our right, we need our right, we have minority rights, we have this, and there was dispensations, and we have special status. That for me, really goes against this idea of Ya Qawmi, O my people. Because at that point, it goes into what I would say is responsibilities. And responsibilities are related to morality, are related to acting good, being virtuous. And the prophetic method, which is going to really demolish this whole narrative amongst Muslims about we need our rights, we need to fight Islamophobia, and people will misunderstand this, absolutely, I know this. But essentially the moment that you focus in on your rights, and we need to get our rights, even in a relationship, you do counseling, in a relationship where you have the husband or the wife, I can see you smiling. At the moment that the husband or the wife insist on getting their rights, it becomes transactional, and it becomes restricted to the ability of somebody to give you your rights. In other words, the counselor, the legal system, the divorce lawyer, all these things can give you your rights. But that is not a moral position. In other words, rights are not based on morality, they're based on legal systems. In fact, they're related to punitive interference from the law, from the state. What I'm saying, and what the Sunnah would say, and this is what I think is very unpopular for Muslim ears, which is why I always get misunderstood totally, is that you have to, if you believe that you have something to give people, and if you're a Muslim, you have to, I mean, this is the whole thing, you can't get out of this. It's like Khabib getting you in a tapping situation in mixed martial arts. If you believe your basis here is a religious basis, then these are your people, and therefore you have to focus in on your responsibility. And I'll tell you, we're coming into autumn. This is autumn. You can see the sun was out, but it was actually very cold today. I was cycling to my office here, and you can compare the difference between rights and responsibilities to a tree in autumn, because responsibility is like the trunk. It's the roots and the trunk. It's the thing that make the tree solid. And then the rights are really the flowers or the leaves that come up, and then the leaves come and they go. What your rights were as a Muslim 40 years ago are not the rights that you have now. And if you project into 20 years into the future, your rights as a Muslim will not be the same as your rights today.
Right.
And you can say that for any minority. So if you're saying, well, we can say what we want because we're Muslims, okay, today you might be, but tomorrow you might not be. So if you've got Elon Musk on this massive screen like 1984 Orwellian addressing this march where there's, Tommy Robinson and all these far right extremists, and he's saying, guys, you need to get onto the streets and start fighting, it essentially means that there's a whole movement where not just activists and far right, but mainstream political parties like the Labour Party, the Conservatives, obviously, Reform, obviously, but lots of parties. I was listening, I was actually reading something about the Liberal Democrats, musing over bringing in ID, national ID cards.
Right.
So essentially, the things that you thought were rights are going to change, because the moment you have that, something, a card that says, this is my number, my ID, some of your rights have been taken away. And that's why in liberalism and the liberal philosophical position is that you shouldn't have, ID cards, because it takes away some of your rights to be free. So essentially what we get to is the fact that we have to decide, do we want to keep going along this line of we want our rights, this is our rights, or do you want to start to listen and see what would change if we said, okay, what's our responsibilities? You as a person, as a counselor, me as a scholar, you as a scholar, your imam as an imam, people in the NHS who are Muslims, parents, every single Muslim, the moment they hit the age of puberty, if we were to say, what's your responsibility to your people? and your people doesn't mean you're Muslim, it means everybody in the street. How would that change the narrative? How would that make I would say a shift in our perspective on how to deal with these issues? And for me, that's the big thing.
Okay.
Definitely.
So what you're talking about, it's the focus has been too much on the rights, and there has to be a shift on focus on the responsibility. I'm going to do some.
See, but the reason for that being it shifts it from a legal rights to a responsibility moral perspective.
And it makes sense, because what Faraj is talking about is we need to leave the Human Rights Convention, we need to leave this, we need to do that in order to reframe our rights.
You can see that rights are something that are malleable and they come and go, and human history is all about rights changing. But guess what? Responsibilities, religious responsibilities, are perennial, they're prophetic, they are enshrined. And as Muslims, the reason why we are so annoying to people is that we take our religion seriously, and we exercise a right, let's just say right, to express ourselves religiously. It's not our problem that we take our religion seriously. If Sikhs or Hindus took it seriously and they lived up to what they were supposed to, maybe people would say, well, we need to throw them out as well, but it is what it is.
Two words that came up onto the I'm going to just conceptualize a bit, break down the words, and then I do want to look at maybe one perhaps historic example. Obviously, Muslim Spain, that's quite interesting. So the kind of sociological definition, just very quickly, Sheikh, was integration means becoming part of the society and participating fully in civic life without shedding one's essential religious and cultural identity. Whereas assimilation, on the other hand, implies absorbing into the majority culture to the point of losing distinctive identity or values. Would you kind of agree with that? And number two,
these are working definitions, aren't they?
Sure. How does a Muslim conceptualize integration and assimilation? Like, what would be a close word in Arabic that we can understand, or something from the tradition which spells this out for us? And I know this is a modern kind of construct, but going back, can we find anything giving a conceptual framework to this from our own tradition?
So you're meaning assimilation and integration?
Yeah.
So, the thing about, this is to do with modern language, you don't go into this, but neologisms, which are new words that are brought in and given concepts, only appear within a very specific context. And these two terms are fairly relevant, but they're also recent. And they try in, the big word is reify, basically to separate two specific phenomena. Let's just take that thing I was talking about, a Scottishman, Englishman, Irishman walking into a pub, and they say Bilal is sitting there. Is he integrating or is he assimilating? Because what is he doing? Is he essentially trying to tell them that I've assimilated, I've integrated? Because essentially integration for me would mean that he wouldn't be in the pub. They wouldn't find him in the pub. They would find him outside helping. The assimilation would be that he goes from Bilal to Billy, and he essentially doesn't feel any sense of shame in drinking and doing whatever it takes to be with the in crowd. And that's essentially the difference between the two terms. In terms of our Islamic tradition, it's an interesting thing whether you would have corresponding. You wouldn't. I'm absolutely sure you wouldn't, because you have. If you look at the Prophet ﷺ sending his companions to Abyssinia, for example, is a perfect. This is the first example, almost like a test case, where you have a minority of people. This is, say, minority as a numerical thing, going to a specific area, dispossessed from their original land, which is Makkah al-Mukarramah. They go and they give essentially what there's two things you can say here. One is that they set out their creedal religious position about Christianity, and they also say that if you accept us to be here, we will be full parts civically of your society. But this is what we will not compromise on. So this is integration. So at no point in any religious text do I ever recall a scholar saying, well, this is what we need to do, which is to integrate. What they did was they kept the religious creedal situation out of the responsibility. Remember I was talking about responsibility. They didn't go and say, give me my rights, give us our rights, because no, they said, our prophet has said that you will find a just king where nobody is dealt except based upon truth. And they came on that basis. And that's a base of justice. And also when they came, they said, we will be full partners in the civic process. In other words, we'll be part of society. And that went all through the Prophet and Sunnah. You know, even when you have the what they now call the Constitution of Madinah Nawara,
Yes.
Bani Abdul Auf, I think it was a Jewish tribe. It was said that they were part of the community, but for them is the right of the religion. In other words, the religious was acknowledged to be separate. They were Jews, but they were part of the community. In other words, they were part of a confederation. And that is something the Prophet ﷺ, I think all through the seerah, what you find is that he encouraged different, even religious groupings to integrate into a social political whole. And that was based not on rights. They didn't say this is our right, my right is this. They would be people that would defend. And remember, the whole Medinan Pact was based upon defense from attack. All the tribes, the polytheists amongst them, the Jews amongst them, the Muhajirin and Ansar, all of them, the pagans, were all joined together on this basic premise of defending, which is all about responsibility, it's not about right. So what you do is a definite correlation with integration. And you have in the Quranic text a very clear condemnation of assimilation, because assimilation essentially means in Arabic tadweeb, is ways to melt to the point that you have nothing. So there's your word, tadweeb. It'd be good to Google what assimilation means in Arabic, but it's basically melting away to the point that you're less. Yeah.
So we should have a banner that says integration is Sunnah.
No, integration is Sunnah. I mean, if you look at the Prophet ﷺ, what he, if you look at his life, if you look at the principles, because if you think on the rubrics of rights and keeping your core principles, but then coming together on a rights basis, then that is integrating, because it's creating vitality within the community. And I think that is the segue to where you can then address people who were on the streets a week ago, white working class people who were on the streets for a specific reason, whether there was people justifiably there because they felt that there was, immigrants coming without any, checks or balances, where there was a hotel, this is the famous thing, is a hotel in a rural town where immigrants have been brought in, and there's been let's say a sex attack, for example. If you've got children and if you've got daughters, it doesn't matter what religion you are, you would be would be put in a situation where you would want to not just have answers, but you take action. Let's just be very clear about that. And so the fact is that there are very tangible reasons why people do feel uneasy and come out. But the rights, the rights rhetoric is essentially to tell those people, which are white working class people, that you have no right to demonstrate. You just have to accept because you caused the wars in the first place. Like you caused the Iraq war, you caused the Afghan situation, you precipitated the war in Syria, whatever. I don't think that's an Islamic or prophetic way of addressing it. The prophetic way is to engage and to discuss and to see what the issue is. If you were to say, to me, one of the grievances that Tommy Robinson has, misappropriated is the whole thing of grooming gangs, for example. Now, you can't just say, no, this is, sex attackers are equally spread between Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, white, black, everything. It doesn't still address the fact that there is a demographic and a systemic issue which represents people who are Muslim that do it. whether it's the nighttime economy, whether it's to do with, you know, preying on girls that are falling out of the social system. There's still a systemic issue there. You can't just say, oh, well, there's pedophiles everywhere, there's people that abuse everywhere. You still have to realize that there is a grievance and not just dismiss it and say, well, it's the social work's fault, it's the police that are at fault here. The responsibility hat that you now, I think the prophetic hat, which is a responsibility, is that you have to engage with these very difficult situations and conversations. And you can't just vilify the people who came out on the streets and caricature them as being drunk white lads. And there's plenty of them, you know, there is, let's just say that is true. But the reason why they're getting traction is because they are not being listened to, or they feel they're not being listened to. And I think the prophetic way would not be to dismiss them. You know, I think that's definitely the prophetic way. The Sunnah would not, and the Seerah would definitely tell you that the Prophet would listen to the criticism, the harsh criticism. I remember I was with Habib Omar the year I left Yemen, and I had to translate for him, and there was somebody from, I think, Canada, and he was very abusive. He was very foul-mouthed. But Habib Omar just listened to him. He just let him rant. And I think I was just sitting there and I was translating. I refused to translate at a certain point, and he said, no, what is he saying? So I had to translate all this garbage, but essentially, you have to listen. So this is why the Prophet is called Udnu Khairil Lakum. In the Quran, the Prophet is called the one that has his ears out for you. In other words, is listening to your problems, even if they're bitter. And I think the whole thing, you know, where we are now is we've been entranced in Muslim voices that say we should fight for our rights, we should, you know, claim everything that we have and not feel part of society, not, you know, go that extra mile to show that we have responsibilities. And I think that's unfortunate.
When we look at the Sunnah model, and you very kind of eloquently mentioned that, but even when Islam was projecting power, it wasn't projecting assimilation. There was a type of integration. So when you look at the early Umayyad period, Syriac was still used. There's reports saying that Muawiyah was wearing the clothes of the Syrians. Only Abdul Malik bin Marwan later brings Arabic actually into it. But at its peak of projecting political might, it didn't require or precipitate assimilation from the quote unquote indigenous communities who actually had lived there.
Absolutely. I mean, so the Muslims did not demand assimilation. You know, what they did was insist upon the integration model of the Prophet ﷺ, which is what I just described, the political, social, civic integration of everybody under the auspices of the Khalifa, to the point that Abdul Malik ibn Marwan and the Umayyads were actually charged with actually trying to, and this is a false charge, but almost trying to entice people into not converting, to kind of keep that assimilation, you know, trope at arm's length, so that they kept this Arab, you mentioned it yourself, Arab nature of Islam alive. And I mean, modern Muslim thinkers like Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida still had that sense that Islam should remain with a type of Arab spirit. And that kind of, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a racist, there is an elitist element to lots of Muslim modern writers in the Arab world. But absolutely, I mean, there was, even the Ottoman Empire, they had the millet system, which was all about integration, not assimilation. It was only until, you know, about 500 years into Muslim rule that Egypt became majority Muslim. The Levant, Syria, Greater Syria, which is Palestine and Syria and Jordan, all those countries became majority Muslim 500 or 600 years afterwards. Imam Subki has a famous section in one of his works where he basically, you know, laments the fact that why there's so many people you know, that are not embracing Islam? Why are they just allowed to remain Christians and Assyriac and Orthodox? And, you know, why is there so much freedom? The reality was that's prophetic. And he was so intensely engrossed in the minutiae of law and theology that he didn't understand the wider picture of the Prophet, which was that you provide the civic safety so that people see the beauty of Islam. This is why when Sayyidina Umar came to Egypt, the first thing he said to them, he said that متى استعبدتكم الرجال وقد ولدتكم أمهاتكم أحرارا. You know, since when have you become slaves to people when you were born free from your mother's womb? In other words, that's your deep held existential reality that you're free. And now if you want to become Muslim, but I'm going to give you freedom. I'm going to give you the ability to integrate into society as an equal. And that was the great calling of our khulafa.
So the strength of another wee example just from the history, and then I promise I'll move on. If I go back to my earlier question of where our parents right or wrong, and I remember a clear moment where I used to think, you know, this is a bit ridiculous. We're never going to be, you know, kicked out, quote unquote. And I remember reading there's a book called Blood and Faith: The Purging of Muslim Spain, and Matthew Carr is an academic who writes this, and I found it very, very stark, because we go through the high period of kind of multiculturalism, integration, and then we come to the period where the Catholics are expanding, and then just before the Al-Pujara rebellion, then that finally happens. And then it's about deep assimilation to the point, and you know this better than me, Sheikh, where the Muslims would go into Catholic practices. They would do that, but whilst they were doing the cross, they had certain awrad. They would read Surah Ikhlas when we do this. If you were caught on showering on Friday, you know. And then there's the final where they put onto boats and sent back to Morocco, and it's a very chilling account. Some of the boats are robbed. The Muslims going back cannot relate to Morocco at that time. They're actually very different. And I remember the next day saying to my mum, actually, I think you may be right. I've just read this really chilling book and very raw. But one thing that interesting that came out of that, and I wonder how that would look like on the other side. So we had the Christian Arabs at that time. They were categorized as a Mozarbs, and it was taken from the Arab world, Musta'arab. So they're Christians, but they are come Arabicized. So remain Christian, they paid the jizya, but they had adopted local culture. If we flip that, if we became the quote unquote in a verse Musta'arab, so you know, if we flip what does that look like for us? So flipping it, where you know Maimonides was Jewish, but he's writing in Arabic, and you know all of that kind of stuff. So if we were to flip that, how would it look like for Muslims to be in the West, adopt the culture of the West, but remain Muslim?
How would it look? It would look like it's looking. But the other thing you have to factor in is that you're living in a very materialistic age.
Right.
So that whole process took place, like William Durant talks about the age of faith, that all took place in the age of faith. And so the underlying all that was the fact that you had faith. Now what you have is the dominant culture. The dominant culture is essentially materialistic, but also atheistic. And so to become mustaghrab,
yeah, we become mustaghrab now, not musta'arab.
We become mustaghrab is like become westernized, but also gharib, which is like stranger. So there's a strange word, mustaghrab, is to adopt that dominant culture, which is materialistic. And this is why I'm not going to name people, but there's dominant people that have taken on that culture. I'm thinking of a couple of people in the tech world who've left their faith. I mean, they're Muslims by name, but they've essentially left their faith. Because to become mustaghrab, you have to, you know, buy into the whole thing, the whole package. which is we will dress like them, we will eat like them, we will speak like them, we will laugh like them, we will listen to the music like them, we will do everything like them. Maimonides dressed like Muslims because it was a dominant culture. We will do the same thing. But unfortunately, we don't have a dominant culture which is theistic. And that is the reason why we cannot recreate that amazing cycle that took place in the past, where religious civilizations almost incited people to become part of them. There was something sweet about becoming musta'arab, like an Arab for a Christian. There was something about refinement. There was something about the way you dressed, the way you walked, the way you smelled. The way you smelled as well would be, this is why we need to become musta'arab, because you actually wash yourself. Now that's not the case. I mean, there was all this thing about vaccination. I was reading about one of the wives of the British ambassadors to Istanbul, who basically came back with inoculations from chickenpox, based upon the fact she saw that amongst Istanbulite women, basically taking their children to other people afflicted with chickenpox to immunize them. And she took it back to London, and she was attacked for being a heretic. But what she realizes was that this was something that we could look up to. The situation we have now is, and the question we have now is, if you want to remain a person of faith and you want to adopt, let's just say, the positive of the West, what would that look like? Essentially, what is it of Western culture that we can adopt? Because essentially, if it's something we should adopt, it should be entrenched within Muslim, our own tradition. It's being on time, having, keeping to your word, all these things that we admire about the West. Really impressing yourself upon an issue or a question. The Prophet himself, Amr ibn al-As radiyallahu anhu, mentioned a number of things about the people of the West, which is the Bani Asfar, which are worthy of being emulated. They never allow their leaders to oppress them. They're quick to come back from defeat, and they will never give in to tyrants. All these things are things that we should aspire to as well. So if there's something that you would imagine we would want to be like, copying the West, it'd be something that's already entrenched within our tradition anyway.
Okay. Yeah, correct. And no, absolutely. And I suppose that's where we hear, often quotes like, when scholars came to Europe, they saw Islam but not Muslims, and then they went back to Muslim countries and they saw Muslim but kind of not Islam. And as I was preparing for this, I think sociologists call something like segmented assimilation. So there's kind of I don't know if the assimilation is a correct word, but it's like one form is you integrate, so you take as a Muslim strong education and career, but you still have your Muslim morals. But then there's selective assimilation, which you talked about, the Bilal. There's upward mobility, but religious dilution. So you're doing well, but and then the one that interested me was the kind of the oppositional subculture, which I found very fascinating. And I felt, but growing up in Glasgow with the kind of gangs and all of that kind of stuff. So these people, they reject.
I'm excited here.
They reject their parents' culture because they can't connect with it, but they reject mainstream culture because they're at odds with authority. So they create a new kind of identity, which is something like oppositional subculture. So they kind of go into gangs and stuff. I found that very interesting. A lot of Muslims, I recently met, there's a new person who's head of the Scottish prisons, and he's saying, Muslims are, unfortunately, when the statistics come, they're much higher in prison. So just want to your thoughts on that part where it's not parents, it's not assimilation or integration, but it's another type of hybrid kind of they've fallen into.
Essentially what's happening there is something that essentially you could say happened in that massive march that took place, which is it's rebellion, because people live based on identity. People like to we're social beings. I mean, Ibn Khaldun mentioned this, and he had a whole theory about socialization. We're social beings. We're you know, the word insan in Arabic actually comes from uns, which is to have sociability. And so you have to have a cultural sense, identity, meaning, and that comes from a social group. And if the dominant narrative is not something that you ascribe to, you will create your own in crowd. So you have gangs. But for me, what's interesting is also, so that creates your belonging, that creates your kind of integration into a part of society which is recognized, which is a gang or a group of young males or young females. But what's interesting about that is that is, is something that is also mirrored in a lot of religious groups that we have. So, for example, I was watching something about last week about there was I can't remember her name actually. There's a female journalist from Luton who went back to Luton to this. I think it was made by Channel 3. Somebody will probably know what it is. It was about she went to Luton to find out her friend, find out what her friends were doing. A lot of them are Muslims, and obviously Luton is famous. It's got it's got all these characters. I'm not going to mention them, but there are all these characters there. And she was just surprised at the degree of fracturing in Luton based on religious, ideological, ethnic grounds. So she went and she found all these, white supremacists. Then she also went to a march which was, Al-Muhajirun or something, calling for the death of the British Army or something. And famously, the EDL is said to have kind of come out of a number of episodes that took place in Luton. But what you have is that same sense of identity around ideological religious grounds. And it's always on the extremities of society. So the gangs are on the extremities, but these religious groupings are also, I would say, on the extremities, and they push the agenda. Because the EDL came into existence because of, you could say, as a counter-reaction to certain Muslim voices, let's just say. Muhajirun were an offshoot of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Hizb ut-Tahrir basically kind of disappeared from the landscape for a good couple of decades until it's re-emerged. So that, for me, is an interesting insight into how societies create subcultures that you're talking about. So these subcultures are integrated into a small part where they can survive on the extremities, which is different from what we want. We want to be in the midst of power, in the midst of culture, in the midst of integration. And what your question initially was is, what would that person look like who's integrated but Muslim? I mean, the thing is, can you get to the point that you have power and volition and choice and still remain integrated but not assimilated? That's the whole thing with all the Muslim politicians that we have. It's always the case that you say, well, the person sold out the religious tenets. That's the cop out from people, because they say, well, how would that person get there unless they'd sold their soul to the devil, which is very, very much reductionist. And I think it doesn't. I mean, because this morning I was actually summarizing the history of the Khulafa for my daughter. She's doing a GCSE in Islamic Studies, and I was going through, quick 3 hours of summarizing the whole Khulafa period. And if people looked to the details of that whole period, they would realize that it was a very tumultuous and destructive period in many ways. Civil wars, infighting, fitna everywhere. And I think a lot of Muslims live in a very rosy world where they think if Islam was implemented, it would be, everything would be easy. Life is never easy. And the moment you have power, you have ability to corrupt. And there's always, even amongst the most pious of people, there's people on the extremities that pull them into things that they would never want to do. If that's the case at the time of the Prophet ﷺ's companions, then what do you expect about this day and age? I mean, just use your brain.
Talking about the four khulafa, if we go into the life of four imams, I'm just trying to think here. Can we? How does? I suppose it was more political integration. So, like Sayyidina Imam Malik radiallahu ta'ala anhu being flogged, Imam Abu Hanifa refusing the leadership. Was that a fear of political assimilation in that regard? That, you know, this idea that we will give up our core and we will be part of something that we cannot recognize ourselves to be, so we would move, or am I wrong here, or can we view it?
Can you just rephrase that again, just from the beginning? Because I got the question and I missed it.
So when we look at the life of the Imam, so Imam Malik and Imam Abu Hanifa, did they resist what they resisted and were flogged and punished for that because they feared political assimilation?
Okay. I mean, political assimilation of the religious voice, because they represent what the religious voice.
Yes, correct.
So being subsumed within a dominant paradigm, which is power and wealth. And I think this is a fascinating area, because you know what, it segues into the separation of religion and politics in Islam. Because the whole thing in the West, the big trope, is that Islam insists upon the meshing of religion and politics, worldly and religious, the secular and the religious. So this whole thing that the West always says, after the religious wars, we separated church from the state.
Correct. Yeah.
To be honest, I believe, and all my research has showed me that took place within the last years of Sayyidina Ali's Khilafah. Scholars saw the corrupting nature of power, and the whole, I mean, this morning when I was doing it, it just actually entrenched that.
Yeah.
Is that you cannot remain with a religious moral voice in the midst of power without corrupting it. And therefore, you have to have religious voices that are outside that paradigm. So they have to be almost an alternative pillar in society, which shows people an ideal, and then you have the power, which is always going to be messy. There's always going to be the Ottomans that did amazing things and built amazing mosques, but still killed their brothers and sons, and you know, the whole thing that you know about. And you know, that's just one example of many. And so when they refuse to become integrated into the state system, yeah, absolutely, I think that's a subsection of our discussion, which is, you know, they wanted to keep this religious narrative clear and distinct and vital, and having this vitality that you could always go back to, okay, what is the ideal in a society? So religious voice has to be, in a sense, distant. But saying that, Imam Malik is famous for his fatwa that scholars should not shun rulers. They should go and visit and teach and give nasiha and advise and make sure that they are on side as much as possible. Whereas, you know, others, Imam Suyuti's got a book I've got here, which is all about never going and seeing a ruler. But the thing is, well, who's going to advise? In an ideal world, yeah, it sounds fantastic not to advise and admonish, but the reality is you have to, you know, the Prophet said, the best of jihad is kalimatul haqq inda sultanin ja'ir. It's the word of truth inda sultanin ja'ir. Inda means in the face of, right in front of, not on your Twitter feed or your WhatsApp or. So this is courage, and it means that you have to push yourself into that environment. So yeah.
Sorry, I had something, but I've just kind of lost it when you made that last point. Yes. So basically, so what you're saying, there's no science to it. It's an art. It's
there's never been a science to it.
Yeah. It's almost an art.
I mean, this is why it's permissible to disagree. Like, it's perfectly permissible for you to disagree on the way that you engage in politics and power from me. I mean, I'm not going to do takfir of a person that disagrees on whether they vote for the Conservatives or your part. Was it your party? Was it? So this is
My party or your party?
no. Come on, we need to agree on a
I know,
name.
I'm kidding. Yeah, your party.
Which shows the whole craziness of the situation. I mean, am I going to say that you're a heretic because you've not signed up to your party? Or that I'm siding? I mean, you can see the ramifications of that in the Muslim world as well, like in terms of political affiliation or nasiha or whatever it is. It's something that is messy. Yeah, it's just something that's messy. This whole area is messy.
I don't want to go into this, but I know you really enjoy talking about it, and I really enjoy listening. But you talked about the nature of the dominant culture, and it's very dominant. So Charles Taylor, while Halak and others talk about kind of modernity, postmodernism, and this kind of this monotonous culture that has killed off in a way the localized culture with Islam had really kind of celebrated. And obviously the fallback from that has the white male being disenfranchised by globalization. And I suppose one of the way they're taking the frustration now is on the migrant. I want to come back to the idea of responsibility you mentioned, because I think this goes back to virtue ethics and Alistair McIntyre, who I know you've kind of been deeply engaging with. What would McIntyre, from his kind of Christian viewpoint, look at integration, assimilation, and the idea of kind of this covenantal ethic, this idea of covenant and responsibility that we have?
So I think, he passed away, I think, a couple of years ago now. And he was interested because he was obviously, he was more left-leaning, and then he came into a realization of the nihilistic nature of society and philosophy at his time, and he went and did a complete U-turn into the Catholic tradition and virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is essentially about centering what is right based upon the virtue of morality, and it was good action. So we know that from Imam Ghazali, for example. If you want to just give it, a shortcut into what we were talking about, virtue ethics is all about acting right. It's all about responsibility and how you fulfill that. So there's a number of issues that he kind of comes up with. One of the interesting one is the issue of covenant and the cardinal virtues that people have to adhere to. And I think in the white minority, they're almost a minority now. There is this vacuum of values where they're not essentially Christian, and this is one of the almost comical observations I've had of what's been happening over the last couple of weeks, is that people say they want to go back to Christianity, but they have no sense of what Christianity is, no sense of what morality is. It's a Christian country, so he would be looking at this with a degree of disbelief. I think he was education in Glasgow. I think he was essentially educated in Glasgow University, and so he'll know the whole culture of. He's working class as well, and essentially he's very interesting. And so he would probably say that you have to entrench that virtue ethics as a covenant through things like the Boys Brigade, through basic communal activities that actually embed morality in the granular acts of people in a society. I don't know if you know about the Boys Brigade or the Scouts and all these things, which actually showed you how to live morally, showed you about responsibility, not about rights, but responsibilities. That's the thing. Everything's been taken away from these people. And they're left as consumers. They're left as people that just look at other people with iPhones coming over as immigrants. And then there's this sense of envy and rancor and anger. Obviously, it comes out of what? It comes out of the fact that they're basically consumers now. They're not moral beings anymore from that perspective. So I think that's what we have to have a degree of pity, I think, on this, this phenomena, which is the disenfranchisement of, the white working class as well. Which is, again, coming back to the first point I made about our community, Ya Qawmi, our people. These are our people. I remember the first time I met Sheikh Abdul Qadir Asufi. He came to Glasgow, and it was really, I remember it was really, really cold. I was freezing, and he was in a small room, and he was saying, you need to go to the job centres and you need to get the people who are unemployed and tell them about Islam, because this is the thing that will give them hope. And I was thinking, why do you go to university and tell these intelligent people about Islam? And he was saying, no, you have to get the people that are disenfranchised and basically thrown out by society and tell them about the light of Islam. And it's just now I'm starting to understand, that was such an amazing insight. That it's not about being intelligent. It's about every single person listening to this knowing that the people they interact with day in, day out are their people, and they have a responsibility to these people. The whole thing of rights and asking for your rights and this whole crying Islamophobia is another thing, which I don't want to go into today, but is something that Muslims need to think about, whether that Islamophobia, rights narrative is even something that we should be taking on as a community, because I think it's very destructive and it just takes away from the prophetic. And Abdul Murad, I think he talks about that in one of his essays, in one of his collected essays. He calls it Lahabism, anti-Muslim hate. He says the moment you call it Islamophobia, you're essentially tying into a rights narrative. They hate Islam and the practice of it, which is something completely different.
And there's a very interesting point you made there, about how the far right people are using Christianity as eroding. So this is a Christian country, but someone who, like McIntyre, is deeply engaged with Christianity, I would find that kind of obnoxious that these people are reflecting my faith. Obviously, in preparation for the seminar, I went through Sheikh Abdul Hakim's book. I read it when it was first published a couple of years ago, I think. And then obviously I've read through it now. It's quite interesting because a lot of it, it's kind of relevant. I'm just going to, if it's okay, Sheikh, just read maybe a couple of sentences. I found quite, this is just from the introduction. Islam understood better than anyone that a universal truth is worth more than local particularisms. And this is obvious in this post-axial and unparochial of monotheisms. But paradoxically, it is for this same reason that Muslims find themselves at home everywhere. For this same universalism of Islam enables a local rooting which recognizes that, the Quran says, wherever soever you may turn, there is God's face. Following its Abrahamic nature and Mohammedan example, Islam has shown itself an intrinsically portable religion with a strong historic culture of migration, hijrah, and of migrants, muhajirun. The man of praise, like Abraham, was himself a refugee, asylum seeker, arriving destitute in his new shelter. The hijrah bisected and defined his entire prophetic career. Yet he became to conceive a love for Medina as well as for his native city, and this Darul Hijrah turned into his permanent and authentic home.
But there you go. That's my whole point, wasn't it? The whole idea of the difference between rights and responsibilities. The fact that he made Darul Hijrah his home and he wept for it and he prayed twice as much for Medina as Ibrahim did, alayhi salatu wasalam, for Mecca, is a testament to the fact that he felt integrated into the soil, into, in an organic way integrated. This is fascinating. And so that's the thing I don't hear amongst our kind of podcast contributors and Muslim political commentators, and it's all about rights. It's all about, it's basically dancing with the devil. And, essentially there's gonna be two people dancing, even if you've got a fantastic argument and you're showing the shallowness of the opposite side, it's still essentially not engaging with your identity, which is Islamic, faith-based, moral, and based upon responsibility. Like the whole point is the Prophet on the Day of Judgment will be asked, did he fulfill his responsibility? And the Prophet said, Kullukum ra'in. Do you understand? So there's a whole thing that I think we've missed, which is Kullukum ra'in. Each of you is a shepherd and each of you is responsible for what they're shepherding. And so it's about responsibility. The Prophet never, I mean, I'm struggling over the time I've been writing a book about identity for a couple of years. And I've been struggling to find somewhere where the Prophet has been emphasizing your right over your responsibility when they're mutually exclusive. It's always about responsibility. And I think our political leaders, our Muslim, commentators, the people we listen to and we think are doing a great job, because the reality is we're talking in a context of Gaza, where that march that took place essentially was on the back of the fact that the powers that be realized that the Palestinian issue is becoming the issue of the age. It's becoming exactly what South Africa was, in the 80s, and it's not going to go away. And how can you counter that except by creating a show on the side which is stoking up religious tension and racial tension and anti-immigrant sentiment, so that people will lose sight of the fact that there's a genocide going on. And even the whole thing with flags, the saltire and the Union Jack and the cross of the English, all that is essentially to replace the Palestinian flag, which is coming up everywhere because people are showing it, and it's just an attempt to steer people away from the crime of the age. In that context, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we have a long-term responsibility to where we are. And so this whole thing, the last thing we talked about, integration, assimilation, or emigration should not be is not even on the table. As a religious perspective, it's not there. It's a lifestyle, maybe it might be economic or whatever. It's not something that's integral to our religious tradition, unless you're forced. So unless you're forced, you have to go. If you're not forced and you have the ability to lay your roots in a culture and a society, you're the people that will, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat lin-nas. You're the best of people that were brought forth for the sake of mankind. Even that verse, look at that responsibility. Ukhrijat lin-nasi, for people, and it was for the service of people. So there you go. I mean, it's all about knuckling down, digging deep, changing our narrative, changing our perspective, inshallah, and then saying Bismillah. I think that's the best way that we can go ahead.
And I think you're right. I think for as Muslims naturally who gravitated towards the left, I think we've occupied the space so much that this concept of rights, it's almost, it's like kind of, it's very
There's somebody who said,
us.
should it be part of our responsibility to establish rights? So it is obviously it is. Like the whole thing that we missed is that when the rights bill for minority safeguards was instituted in I think 2010, Muslims didn't really utilize it and didn't really test it and see the degree to which they were able to gain specific rights that are shared with other people as citizens. So we're not talking about the fact that you shouldn't seek out rights that are yours as citizens. We're talking about the fact that they're in a mutually exclusive situation. Your priority actually is looking at your responsibility and not making your priority the rights. That's the problem. So it's not about either or. It's about perspective. It's about emphasis. I think that's the best thing.
One more thing, and then we have a question. Question, interestingly, is from Billy, the guy in the joke. With the West becoming increasingly divided across political lines and differences, how do Muslims navigate this with Islam having opinions across a political spectrum without becoming isolated?
So what do you think? I mean, based on what I've said, I kind of intonated on this. I don't know if the person heard it, but it's almost as if your religious orthodoxy is based upon what political party you vote for. Like, so imagine there's a fictitious city in England where you've got Labour, Conservatives, and all the parties, and there's a Green Party. So everyone's saying you have to vote for Green because we'll be able to oust the Conservative. And then it gets to the point that if a Muslim says, no, I actually prefer the X, Y, or Z policy of the Conservatives, and then it's basically, you're a munafiq, or you are, so you're a hypocrite, or even it'll get more heated actually. I think we have to stop conflating political disagreement with ethical, moral disagreement. So could you envisage a Muslim as a member of the Conservative Party or Reform, for example? Let's just go to the extreme.
We don't need to. I think the Zia guys.
My point is, as a hypothetical, are we at the point that we have become a community which is solely based on ethnicity and identity?
Yeah.
Like the Jewish community. If that is what we've become, then essentially we, might as well give up, because Jews, the Zionists, don't believe in God. I mean, Jews generally don't believe in God. They've got to the point where, they've coupled Zionism as an ideology which does not require the inward faith in God. It requires the outward faith in God. So you'll find majority of the people that led the Zionist state didn't believe in God, but they had to outwardly insist that God promised them the land to be able to complete an imperialistic land grab. Do you see the situation? So I can imagine Muslims in the same vein creating a khilafah where they take control of a piece of land, and it's merely to exercise political suffrage and power publicly. And that again, I don't want that. I will fight that. I will fight. The whole purpose of teaching is to ensure that you don't have a separation of internal and external religiosity. There has to be ikhlas.
The situation, I think, the next couple of years, it's very, very interesting. Of course, if things are on course, Reform are projected to win. Farage, I think, came out with another kind of news headline, which, funny enough, even made it on the kind of main homepage of BBC about revoking migrant visas. So there's a state of anxiety actually around, even in the Muslim community. How do Muslims navigate the political landscape in the next couple of years? And what I don't mean like who do we vote, but just generally for our iman and, falling into kind of a bit of negativity, misery. Oh my God, what's going to happen? How do we navigate that, and how can we still be very confident in our tradition?
I think we have to take different lenses or layers of analysis. There's the here and now, which creates intense pessimism, and then there's the operational, which is who do we vote for, and then there's the theological, spiritual, which is, Abdulhakim Murad said it, history's in good hands. That these are all ibtila, these are all tests and tribulations. In the whole scheme of standing in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment, the minutiae of what we're talking about is irrelevant, which is why the way to get into God's pleasure is through, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ كَانَتْ لَهُمْ جَنَّةُ الْعَدْنِ. The whole idea is about action and faith, and then getting into a place of God's pleasure. That is what we should be focusing in on while we're doing something. The moment that it's almost like, I don't know why this came to my mind, the egg and spoon race, is it? Like the point is not to get to the end of the race, it's to get to the end of the race with the egg on the spoon. I don't know if some people probably don't know what this game is, but at school, famous, you have a spoon, you have an egg, and you walk. And the whole point is, if you get to the end and you don't have an egg, it's no point. So that is essentially where we are, because you could get to power, you could implement Islamic law, and you could do all these things, and if you're not in paradise and you don't have that moral character of virtue of the Prophet ﷺ, then essentially, there's no point in you doing anything at all. And this is the big theme in our religious tradition, that in the nitty-gritty and the give and take of day-to-day life and all the political situations and the geopolitical situations and the wars and genocides that are taking place, in that context, the prism through which you look at things has to be moral. Absolutely has to be moral. It has to be ethical. It has to be based on fulfilling responsibilities. And that's why I think in a practical sense, people should utilize everything that they have to fulfill that responsibility of being people of this land. The mosques, Islamic centers, people who've got medical know-how, they should be reaching out to provide medical help for people that don't have it. I mean, we do have an NHS, but essentially, if you want to get anything done through the National Health Service, it's broken. And so there's so many avenues for people, even economics. Look at the whole impasse through this kind of very vicious capitalist system, creating people on the periphery of society. Islam has a lot to say about that. And so I think we need to say, okay, this is what we have. Let's pitch Islam again in a positive way. Open the mosques up, have people that can show people around mosques in a way that people understand. These are all things that we can do right away. It's not just something you do once a year. You have Open the Mosque Day once a year or something. Something that we should utilize fully our economic, our human, and our institutional potential, inshallah. And that's the way that you integrate, I think.
So what I'm hearing is we carry on Salah as a priority, salawat, majalis, dhikr, equipping ourselves of Islamic knowledge, being quite confident that Islam has gone through very difficult periods. But inshallah, through that, we kind of gain strength and come closer to Allah and project a type of confidence through mosques and arts and literature and give a healthy alternative to the people.
Yeah, so lift the society up. And at that point, that whole call of push them back to where they came from will disappear, because people will realize, if they don't already, I mean, intelligent people do, we're talking about a minority, they will also realize that these people are here for the good of the community, and they're integrated to the point that they're actually contributing beyond what other people are doing. And we're doing it. I mean, look at charity contributions and all these things, all these markers are well known, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah. Any final thoughts, Sheikh? I mean,
no, I'll leave it to you to conclude, because that's me from my side, inshallah. It's been fantastic speaking to you as an amazing host, as always.
So we started off through understanding assimilation, integration, looking at the historical Muslim Ummah context, looking at you brought the Seerah in, which was very important, the lives of the four Imams, and kind of finishing on a positive note. Just like to mention to those people who tuned in today, Jazakallah khair, and for people commenting and giving questions. Just a quick announcement about the iSyllabus diploma classes are now live. They are more interactive. There's a live Q&A. There's moderated chats, and there's also, if you share with family and friends, there's also some money that you can earn. And like Sheikh Ruzwan mentioned, I suppose he mentioned about the idea that we need to be rooted and look at long term, and that actually really means is knowing our tradition and engaging with it, and having studied iSyllabus and also taught it, and also have majority of family who went through it. I think that's a real beginning to understand the richness and the depth of our tradition. And I think one thing that when you finish iSyllabus, you become very confident about yourself and what you represent, and it gives you the tools actually. And it's a tradition that's very much aligned with kind of living Islam today. It's not something which is restricted to the dusty boots, but it's kind of a tradition which is alive and continues to grow and develop. Jazakallah Sheikh for your insights today.
Jazakallah to you for doing such an amazing
enjoyed
job.
that. I suppose your finger will be on the pulse as things kind of move on and what happens.
Inshallah. Everyone should be concerned. Everyone should be engaged. Everyone should see what they can do. I mean, that's the whole thing. I think we need to take ourselves to account more than other people. I think if you start from that perspective, then you will be much more fulfilled as human beings. We'll be able to impact people much better. We'll be able to serve other people better. We'll be able to impact the lives of people outside the UK, like people in Gaza, much better if we just leverage what we have here. And that's the thing. Our responsibility is not just to ourselves, it's to our families, our community, but also as an ummah, it's to every person who says La ilaha illallah. And that's an amazing opportunity, responsibility, and humbling piece of responsibility on our shoulders that we have to, inshallah, engage with, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah for everyone who tuned in. Sheikh, last thing, promise Sheikh hasn't told me this, but Sheikh Ruzwan has got these amazing courses that he taught over weekends on various topics, very kind of topical, which are found on the iSyllabus demand, which are very focused on kind of modern issues, but with answers kind of deeply rooted in our tradition. So if you also have time, some of them are really good, and the sheikhs, mashallah, I believe are not writing now, so some
interesting stuff.
Good news to come, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.